Hola, buenas tardes a todos y a todos. Rubén, buenas tardes, ¿puedes escucharme?
Sí, hola, buenas.
Hola, muy bien, buenas tardes. ¿Puedes activar tu vídeo?
Y si
Por
me deja el
favor.
sistema, vamos a ver.
Vamos a ver si nos deja el
No,
sistema hoy,
dice
que nos
que
está
the
jugando
host
alguna que
has
otra mala
stopped it.
pasada. Permitir.
Tiene que permitir esto
Venga,
ahí.
inténtalo ahora, que yo creo
Ok.
que te va a dejar. Que hemos cambiado ahí un permiso, ya te tenemos.
Vale. Aquí está.
Genial. Muchas gracias, Rubén. Perdón a todas las espectadoras y espectadores de esta tarde por el pequeño retraso que hemos sufrido. Nada, pequeños problemas técnicos, pero ya estamos listos para empezar con esta sesión de MIGRATALKS, en la que tenemos el gusto de estar con Ruben Andersson, que también nos va a acompañar más tarde en la siguiente sesión de gran formato, que vamos a tener un panel de expertos discutiendo sobre la industria de control migratorio. Y bueno, sin más, bienvenidos a todos y a todas a este Congreso de Periodismo de Migraciones, la tercera edición. Normalmente lo hacemos en Mérida, pero este año lo estamos haciendo de manera online por la situación que todos estamos viviendo. Y bueno, sin más, os dejo con Rubén. Es un placer tenerte con nosotras aquí hoy y muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo.
Pues muchas gracias por la invitación. ¿Me escucháis bien? ¿No? Muy bien.
Perfectamente.
Perfecto. Había pensado hablar en inglés, ya que tenemos un público mixto quizá y además traducción simultánea. Pero bueno, yo puedo cambiar a español en cualquier momento si preferís, o en la pregunta, la discusión, continuamos en castellano. Así que ahí vamos.
Genial, Ruben. Perfecto. Gracias.
Okay, so I'll start off in English then. I just want to say a few things before opening for discussion. I think it's much more interesting to hear your perspectives and to enter into a bit of a dialogue. So I'll try to be fairly brief. I know we're also now slightly behind time. But I just want to briefly set out where I'm coming from on this topic of the border control or migration control industry. So I've been investigating this since 2008 as an anthropologist, I should say. I'm not a journalist, though I have a background in journalism from before my academic days. So hopefully there's some resonance there. And so in my first big project on migration, I set out the notion of what I called in my book Illegality Inc., an illegality industry based on the Spanish experience of fighting illegal or irregular migration in Western North Africa. And the reason why I used this term, the illegality industry, was that the people I spoke to in my research, who were initially deported migrants in Senegal, who had tried to reach the Canary Islands, been sent back to their home communities, were themselves talking about migration as a business. There's lots of money in illegal migration, was how some of the deportees put it to me. And that included not just the usual suspects, the defense contractors, the corporations who provide the hardware for border security, or indeed only the law enforcement that were now patrolling along Senegalese coasts, the Senegalese Navy, the young EU border agency Frontex, Spanish Guardia Civil, and so on. But it also, for the deportee, this business included researchers such as myself, journalists, NGO aid workers. We were all part of that picture somehow. We were all making something out of migration. We are not innocent, in another word. I think that's an important point to reflect on. So what I did in my research, I started to study this system or industry that has grown up around irregular migration over the past decades in the collaboration between European and African states. And I called it an industry not just because of the gains from migration, from fighting migration, important though those are, but also because, as I saw it, this industry constantly manufactures something, is making something. And what is it manufacturing? It's manufacturing more illegality. And what do I mean by that? Well, it creates through more border security measures, new technologies, more dangerous routes. Through those routes, we keep seeing migrants trying to arrive in more difficult circumstances, having to use smugglers. So smuggling networks start professionalizing, get all the more advanced and predatory. So we see a vicious cycle here of each new investment in border security leading to knock-on effects, worse conditions for migrants, and more extreme manifestations of illegality around the borders of Europe, which in turn fuels political fears, public debate, and calls for even more border security. And on it goes, on and on. So it's a bit of a challenge, and this is the topic of today, to how we analyze this, how we disseminate our findings, whether we are academics, journalists, advocacy, rights activists, and so on and so forth. So let's reflect a little bit on that, and I'll just offer a few notes of my own as we start discussing. One big challenge is having access to the right data. It's almost always incomplete. And unlike in the United States, which has really been at the forefront of border security, of fighting migration for several decades, we don't have any comprehensive data set of how much is invested in Europe in fighting migration today. We need to look at various pots. If we want to look at the Spanish case, we need to look at comunidades autónomas, we need to look at the central government in Madrid, we need to look at various pots from development aid to interior ministry and defense funding. Moving up from there, we also need to look at Brussels and EU spending, Frontex in Warsaw and so on, as well as a wider picture of how European states are collaborating among each other in fomenting these investments, as well as in collaboration with African and other non-European states. It's a very complex picture where there's very little transparency, and it's very hard to put a single figure on this, as others, including investigative journalists, have found. The Migrants Files initiative, for instance, of a couple of years ago. Beyond that, of course, is the issue of audience fatigue, or even audience saying, so what? We're spending billions on border security. Why should we care if it's solving the problem of migration that we're so anxious about? There's a big challenge there of getting across a message that doesn't precisely have a receptive audience at the moment. And then there is the challenge of narration, so the ways in which we may try to go beyond that and push beyond audience fatigue, of telling this story of border security, of fighting migration and all its problems in a more compelling way. And I think there are some risks here as well. One of them is search for a big villain, sort of the villain of the piece, the baddies who are responsible for all the problematic stuff going on. Of course, there are some real villains of the piece, perhaps, but often searching for a villain may make us lose sight of the systemic things going on here. How many actors have come to collaborate in border security, even though there may not be some huge specific agenda in all cases behind that. Is simply the way things are now. It's a path dependency, a sort of continuation of this over time that we need to understand in a way as a whole, as a system, as an industry. There's also I guess the appeal of playing into this idea of crisis, human rights crisis, border crisis. These are powerful ways of highlighting the predicament of what's going on. Hello, Aaron. Okay, but you need to go because I'm a little bit busy. It's okay. Bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Cosas del directo y de la conciliación.
Coming into the room.
Everything is all right.
This is a classic that we've had various clips of this on BBC and so on of an interview going wrong. So now I'm joining a long line of celebrity parents. Yes. Anyway, so that's another problem here of how we deal with the framing of this kind of migration as crisis. And often it's quite appealing to play up how dire the situation is, understandably, but that may in turn be appropriated, co-opted by calls for border security. And we've seen this time and again, including at Spanish borders in Ceuta, Melilla, with dramatic pictures of human rights abuses and difficulties at the border being used later on by the Interior Ministry to justify even more border enforcement. Anyway, I'm just looking in case there are any questions, except anything related to the irregular entrant who just came through the door. I have a few points to bear in mind otherwise, that I think stems from my own research, important to keep in mind when disseminating what we find on this border security industries. First point, I have 8 points I've listed here. The first is that these systems are disproportionate. They often target a very small part of migration into Europe, let alone a very small part of migration within origin countries. Why are we investing so much in these particular flows of migrants across land and sea? Second point is that these systems of control lack transparency, accountability, democratic scrutiny, of whom we don't really know what's going on. There's no way to measure what they are really achieving. And that's the third point then, is that often what we do see is that there's a lot of evidence for them not working the way they have been marketed. In fact, we see perverse incentives growing up around these systems, where various actors, including, say, African states, regimes, come to see it beneficial to maintain migratory pressure on Europe, to keep gaining something from controlling migration. We've seen that in Morocco, Mauritania, and other countries in Europe's neighborhood for many years. A fourth point is that these controls don't just affect migrants, others, foreigners, they also affect citizens. We see this very strongly in the United States, not least with the border patrol mandate extending inland and starting to affect also citizens, American citizens, and we're going to see more and more of that, and more of these technologies or trial in migration controls. A fifth point is that these systems of control may be usually beneficial to some, but they also offload costs to others. That includes migrants themselves, of course, who are left in difficulty, but also border communities, health ministries, NGOs, other groups who are left to pick up the pieces. A sixth point is that unlike, let's say, other sectors, other big polluting industries, let's say, in the climate change debate, that outsource or costs to others, in this case, in the migration control industry, the investments are essentially all taxpayer money. And they feed off a vicious cycle that has become over time a virtuous cycle, where more crisis equals more funding, and so on it goes. The penultimate point, seventh point, is that we're not just dealing with economic gains. I think this is where we often lose sight of the big picture. We also need to account for the political gains, and that includes the political gains within destination countries of drumming up a migration crisis, rolling out hard measures against it, but also in partner states in Africa, for instance, who've used a migration crisis and collaboration in fighting migration to achieve recognition, legitimacy, impunity for abuses even. So this political dimension is very important to what's going on. And a final point I want to raise is that we often get quite caught up in the moment when we discuss border and migration controls. There's so much going on right now. There's so much of a sense of crisis that we perhaps forget to historicize. And one important point to mention there is that historically, these migration flows, this border and migration control industry is a very recent phenomenon. In Europe, we hardly saw these kinds of arrivals of pateras, cayucos, and so on before the 1990s, along with visa restrictions that came in at that time for North Africans. So the emergence of these routes has gone hand in hand with a closure of legal routes. And in turn, it has gone hand in hand with more and more border security, leading to more dramatic escalations of crises at the borders. So we need to look back in history, perhaps also to find alternative models for how to deal with migration in a more humane manner that puts its money somewhere else, not in more census and radars and patrolling agreements. So I think that's probably more or less what I wanted to say. I'm still looking out for any questions in the chat, but feel free to jump in.
In the meantime, yo sí tengo una pregunta.
Vale.
Escuchándote, estaba pensando, ¿no? Bueno, siempre hay una crisis, ¿no? Y la crisis migratoria es la excusa para hablar en los medios de comunicación, en los grandes medios de comunicación, sobre el miedo, ¿no? El miedo a lo que está pasando y provocar la difusión de estos discursos de miedo que lo único que hacen es alimentar a esta industria migratoria, ¿no? Como periodistas, como profesionales de la comunicación, ¿qué podemos hacer a este respecto, ¿no? Porque siempre nos dejamos llevar por la urgencia de la noticia, ¿verdad? Y eso al final contribuye a esto que estamos discutiendo hoy, ¿verdad?
Claro, esto es un poco el problema que existe en el periodismo, ¿no? Que lo que cuenta es la urgencia, lo que está pasando ahora mismo, el sentido de crisis. Y claro, el periodismo muchas veces acaba alimentando este marco de crisis alrededor de esta migración, lo cual luego fortalece la seguridad, la industria de seguridad y de controles fronterizos. Pues desde un lado, y claro, esto se ha hecho durante muchos años, incluyendo desde la perspectiva de varios periodistas que están aquí hoy, se puede intentar humanizar la migración, verlo como algo mucho más históricamente presente en contextos muy diarios, muy normales, ¿no? Por ejemplo, Pepe Naranjo, que está aquí, y su trabajo en África Occidental, que ha mostrado cómo la migración forma parte de la vida diaria de muchas personas, muchas otras maneras que no involucra esta clase de crisis en la frontera, ¿no? Luego otra perspectiva importante, creo, es intentar recordar un poco al público la dimensión histórica, ¿no? De cómo era hace unos años, solo hace 30 años, digamos, que no existía esta clase de migración. Hemos llegado ahora, hoy en día, a normalizar un poco, a pensar que esto es algo ya recurrente que va a seguir siendo así. Pues no necesariamente. Y tenemos otras historias quizá que contar, basados en la historia, basados en el pasado, que pueden llevar a otra perspectiva. Y luego está, claro, el trabajo investigativo de investigar la industria como tal, investigar esta política de miedo como tal. Yo creo que ahí también donde hay que centrarse mucho, ¿no? Intentar sacar este trabajo investigativo, divulgativo, alrededor de los intereses poderosos políticos que se han centrado en esta industria, con grandes consecuencias, no solo dentro de Europa, no solo en la industria armamentística, sino también en países vecinos de Europa, donde muchas veces esta lucha contra la migración no ha contribuido a disminuir la crisis, ni a crear una estabilidad, sino más bien lo contrario, ha creado inestabilidad. Lo hemos visto en Libia, por ejemplo, en Sudán, en otros países en el vecindario. Así que hay una gran historia política que contar, pero no es siempre fácil buscar el público y el medio adecuado.
Exacto, mucha razón, Rubén. Estamos en tiempos difíciles también para el periodismo y para estas narrativas que intentan abrirse camino
Claro.
en este mundo de urgencia. Y bueno, pues con mucha pena y sintiéndolo mucho por los espectadores que tenemos aquí, tenemos que ir terminando cuando ha pasado el tiempo muy rápido. Tenemos a Rubén, si queréis seguir disfrutando de él y de todo su conocimiento. Vamos a comenzar otra sesión, otra gran sesión ahora con Rubén y otros 4 grandes expertos en esta materia. Así que nada, muchas gracias a todas y a todos y os esperamos en esa sesión. Muchísimas gracias,
Vale,
Rubén.
perfecto, gracias.